Okay, now I'll begin the world. There goes the microphone. How do you like that? Fell right on my face. Okay. A little disheveled. Okay. This is broadcast number 621. It is October 31st. It's not November tomorrow. It's November. It's October the 31st, 1983. And this is Mae Brussell on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove. Last week, the broadcast went so fast that... What is going on here? 1 minute. We got to get some... Hello. We don't want dead air time here. We want to get the sound up, okay? I'm going to stop for 1 second and put this tape back because it isn't working right. And when I get home, then I have to do the whole hour over. So we'll carry over about 2 more minutes here and let it start over because I don't want to do it over. For 2 or 3 minutes, I can save an hour when I get home. That's fair, huh? How about that? Let's see if it works this time. No, yeah, that's it. This is Mae Brussell. It's broadcast number 621, and it's October the 31st, and it's 1983. Last week I was in such a hurry that I forgot to keep you updated on what is happening, what happened last year, a year ago this week, so we'll cover the 2 weeks really quickly. A year ago, last week, November 25th, I was talking about the drug arrests and William French Smith breaking open the Operation Swordfish, releasing these people and not having the responsibility for them being arrested sufficiently. He wasn't sufficiently criticized. They did talk about in the Washington Post, the San Jose Mercury, Attorney General criticized for the tip-off, the Operation TikTok, and so forth. A year ago, just this week, the drug program is a total failure. I don't know what they expected from Ronald Reagan or Paul Exalt on the drug problem. A year ago, 20th Century Fox stories were breaking in the news. I was talking about the alleged suicide of Norman Gary and the economic problems of Mark Rich and Henry Kissinger making profits over the oil crisis that Mark Rich was involved with. That Mark Rich story has been pushed out of the news just a year later with the Lebanon bombing and with the invasion of Grenada. Everything's kind of quieted. They'll get back to it, but it's been quieted down. I did a profile of Pete Wilson. I call him the Medfly Senator. His blessings of C. Arnold Smith with his political career in the San Diego Union. And Ken Reitz, part of Nixon's Kitty Corps. That's the fellow that I said was so miserable in Los Angeles, talking the anti-Soviet talk. Father worked for Standard Oil, and how Henry Kissinger, Gerald Ford, and Carlton Heston were campaigning for him. He's a very conservative man, but he also has links to the crime syndicate as well, through the C. Arnold Smith and the San Diego gang, and he's also close. I understand DeLorean asked him where to locate his factories. There's a whole nest of people down there that never have been cleaned out down in San Diego. They're similar to the gang down in Miami and Fort Lauderdale, sort of on the edge of water, and ships going down to Mexico and these various islands. Just a year ago, November the 1st, a year ago this week or tonight, John Dean was saying Alexander Haig was Deep Throat. I wouldn't put it past him because after Deep Throat got Richard Nixon out of office, Henry Kissinger and Haig moved up. There's never been a word about this. Haig's been quiet. I talked about the Oroville shooting, the Nazi, the friend of pardon me, I'm looking at the Charles Manson case because that has been quieted down. The person who did the murder of Joseph Hoover, was locked up, but the links to Charles Manson and the equipment that Manson had to leave the jail was never properly exposed by the Oroville shooting down there and the plans for him to go to the property when Manson got out of prison. Also, the Tylenol case, I talked about James Lewis a year ago. He was just found guilty this week of extortion. But the heavy Roger Arnold hasn't been brought in for anything. I was talking about Roger Arnold, his ticket, his one-way ticket for two to Thailand, Hong Kong, and China and so forth that were in his pocket, 2 one-way tickets. His information on cyanide and his possession of cyanide. Roger Arnold is a heavy suspect along with James Lewis, and they're protecting him. So Kevin Mulcahy was murdered, the primary witness to the Edwin Wilson's story, really one of the main ones, because he broke the story 5 years ago and kept wanting Wilson, Turple, and Corcola locked up. And then he was murdered right after Roberta Calvi was murdered in June. And there were a whole string of murders related to the Edwin Wilson case, and they've been quieted ever since. Now, for 2 weeks, the Congress, every member of Congress with Larry Flynt got tapes of the broadcast. I didn't hear from one single member of Congress until today, and William Proxmire sent the tape back. He said, "Dear Ms. Brussell, I've received your correspondence dated October the 10th, along with the cassette you enclosed. Unfortunately, I have in my office neither the facilities nor the staff resources to listen to or transcribe tapes which are sent to me. I'm therefore returning your correspondence. Please be advised for the future that these limitations on my office resources make it impossible for me to respond to views that are sent on tape recordings." He has secretaries and gets almost $1 million a year back there. So what we'll do is just send him a transcript of the tape. Charles Spears has them transcribed every week for people in the news media and serious researchers. So we'll just provide for Mr. Proxmire a copy of the tape. In the meanwhile, the other 539 members of Congress have not responded one way or the other. I don't have too much to say about the invasion of Grenada. The whole thing is sickening. I believe that Reagan planned it for a long time. I'm suspicious of that medical school down there. And there was a picture in the paper today that symbolized to me what Grenada means. It's an Army Ranger up at Fort Lewis, Washington, hugging his wife, Stephanie, when he returns from Grenada. And both of them are black, and she's so happy. He has done the job. Here's Mr. Bishop was murdered. They've come in, the American troops with the C-130s, and they've taken over the island, rounded up all the Cubans. And here's a black man. A black man in America has very few choices of how to earn a living. They need the Army. That keeps them employed. And then the first ones to die or be killed in the various jungles around the world. He needs a job. He's out there on Grenada chasing out poor people who want to change their lifestyle so that white racist societies can take over the island. The Robert Vescos, the kind of people that wanted Dominica Island so they could go chasing black people, unleash them, and chase them like animals. The black people get the privilege of the drugs and narcotics in the ghettos. They're the last to get houses, to get jobs, to get education and health plan. Why is this man so proud of what he did? That's like the Jews rounding up other Jews to put them in concentration camps. They are so pitiful because instead of standing up and saying, I will not wage this war to oppress another group of people who want to have the same standard of living I have, by hook or by crook, he is back from this great invasion, and he's so happy to be back. A few remarks about the 007, the Korean airline, which I haven't done recently. I mentioned a few weeks ago that there's a lawsuit in New York City, written in the New York Times, a woman whose husband was killed on the plane. That's Betty Lim. You may remember the broadcast. Betty Lim, the widow of scientist Dr. Yong Jin Lim, Yongjinlim. Well, there's a story that came out in the newspaper this week. While the Reagan administration continues to charge that the Soviet Union has full responsibility for the South Korean airline, there's a $1 billion claim for damages that was filed with the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, opening up new doors to the United States' role in the tragic event on September the 1st. It's filed by Aaron Broder, B-R-O-D-E-R, and I might have mentioned his name before. It was filed in New York City, September 23rd, in the U.S. District Court in Manhattan, based upon the grounds that the airline deliberately entered Soviet airspace with the knowledge of the U.S. government. Now, what's new about this story is that this particular law firm is the law firm of F. Lee Bailey, who usually represents the federal government, but is representing a widow who is suing the federal government. This lawsuit says they were directly over the most sensitive area of the Soviet defense network at a place we're most interested in. It suggests a deliberate, willful plan to gather intelligence. And they quoted the Los Angeles Herald, September the 4th. It said Moscow may have tolerated other overflights of the airspace, but because they were engaging in sensitive material, they did not overlook this one. The claim for personal injury and wrongful death was filed by Broder's client. He's from the law firm of F. Lee Bailey. He's the attorney who won the largest airline negligence case in U.S. history, $7 million against McDonnell Douglas, for the DC-10 out of Chicago in 1979 at O'Hare Airport. The arrangement of unanswered questions that fit together, this article says about the lawsuit, regarding the plane being shot down arouses suspicion about the fated 007. That's the one with Larry McDonald. How did the plane find itself for 2.5 hours over this territory, they asked. This isn't new, but this is part of the lawsuit. If some miraculous thing happened that it went over this course, which is absolutely impossible, why didn't Japan or Alaska or the RC-135 that was within range of communication alert this plane that was not only off its course, but that was being tracked down by the Soviet interceptor fighter plane? As this tale and events unfold, the status of this plane appears. It makes people more suspicious. It suggests, said Broder of the F. Lee Bailey office, that Ronald Reagan administration knows a great deal more about the United States involvement. The president is anxious to turn away from the catastrophe. There are links between the CIA and the airline, Broder said. Our CIA worked very intimately with the KCIA from Korea. Our CIA was given tremendous impetus by the Reagan administration for an aggressive foreign policy to get as much information as was possible. And remember, there's Larry McDonald on the plane alone. General Keegan, a retired chief of the U.S. Air Force Intelligence Unit, said there may have been more than a score of infringements of Soviet airspace up till now, but this flight was very important. The repeated nature of bruising Soviet airspace suggests that the current airlines working with our government had violated this airspace, which was exclusively sovereignty of the Soviet Union. And Article 36 of the law of the Soviet Union and the state border provides for the use of weapons and combat equipment when the violation cannot be stopped by other means. So the law firm is going into the question of the federal aviation. They have filed in a federal court, and if the federal court rejects it, they'll go into another federal district court. So the law firm of F. Lee Bailey is after the federal government of foreknowledge, representing a client on that matter. Now, a lot of people have asked about Larry Flynt and what's going on in Los Angeles with his tapes. There's a story, Jack Anderson, in the paper today about John DeLorean and the conversation on the tapes. It said the reason the crucial conversations in early stages were not recorded, they don't know why they were recorded. The government has a claim that DeLorean initiated the narcotics, but can't be proven. So the first point that Jack Anderson brings out is who brought up the early stages. Now, I might say that I'm not sympathetic to who, if he's holding it, he could run home. The second point is that he had threats against his family. It's my personal opinion that if he has threats against the family, he ought to call the law enforcement and say who's threatening them and give them their names, and he would have found out that they were federal agents. Jack Anderson says that there's no conclusive evidence that DeLorean initiated it. I don't know the law that well, but I believe that if somebody brings me a stolen car and I buy it and that person is dealing in stolen cars, I'm responsible for that that is received by me. Now, these tapes leave some areas out about, there's a technicality about the word godsend, whether the drugs were a godsend when he got it, or whether he was referring to saving his own company. But the problem here is, I believe, is that I don't have much sympathy. You know, what goes on in Los Angeles is that's Larry Flynt's own business. I've only known him a short while, and he asked me, what did I think about buying the DeLorean tapes? And I personally, I wouldn't mess around with DeLorean at any rate. He had a meeting with Greg Bautzer. Greg Bautzer helped form TCI, which is the corporation that Otto von Bolschwing set up, which was the Nazi Gehlen operation, and Greg Bautzer is trouble anywhere you go. So I wouldn't meet with Greg Bautzer at any time or day, or any of those people. I personally wouldn't. And DeLorean, you remember a while back how the goon squad that he used, Roy Neseth, if you got involved with him, a fellow that worked for John DeLorean by the name of Dick Brown, worked for John DeLorean, and he said that he wouldn't get involved with DeLorean Motor Company. He came from one of the larger motor companies, unless they got Roy Neseth off. He said, take the mob off as vice president, I won't be involved. So DeLorean said that he'd keep Neseth away, and a little while later, 6 months later, Neseth was with him. And Neseth started showing up at the Urban Ranch offices and used Brown's secretary and went on these mysterious trips. And at one point, when Brown didn't want to mess with Nesbitt, he got a phone call from Nesbitt from the Waldorf Astoria saying, if you want to stay alive, if you want to keep your family healthy, you'll cooperate. And Brown said, is that a threat? And Nesbitt said, call it whatever you want. I can back it up. This is a person who has busted other people, their jobs, their inventions. He is not a nice person. And if somebody like Larry Flynt wants to be political, I would suggest, that I wouldn't mess around with those people. Now he's up against the wall, and maybe by next week, it'll all be over one way or the other. I don't know. This is only Monday. By the time the tapes go out, it's the weekend. But I don't think DeLorean is worth saving at all, even if he was entrapped and the other people got off, like Hetrick or these other people, Hoffman. I just would stay away from those kind of people, but I work conservatively and I want to sleep at night, and I don't want to mess with people that have hurt other people. And John DeLorean, for my money, has been a creep all of his life. And if I were going to put any time or energy and had a good platform, Larry Flynt wants to run for president, and he's got a great platform, and he's got good ideas, and he's a really very bright person. He's enthusiastic, and he's well-meaning, and he's got brains. He's got a quick learner like a sponge, and he's got brains. But at some point, the adrenaline gets up, or I don't know what people do to get involved. And if I were going to go to bat for somebody, I went to bat for a lot of people, a lot of prisoners during the terrible years when Reagan was governor here, and Hugo Pinnell and with Louis Tackwood when he was being chased by the LAPD. And some of these people I tried to help. Elmer Davis, who was a victim at the time of the Watergate. He was serving 3 years in jail for an entry at Dr. Fielding's office on Bedford Drive that he never saw in his life. When I'm going to stick my neck out, and it's dangerous for a white woman to stick her neck out for black people that the police department have pegged as patsies, it's going to be for a good cause, and it's not going to be for somebody who has his own death squads. And I certainly wouldn't meet with the likes of these people, because nothing comes of it but pain and sorrow. Now, the Los Angeles Police Department is having hearings on the Black Panther. Actually, Daryl Gates, the head of the police department, has been charged by a law firm of O'Melveny and Myers of infiltrating the law firm and taking information from the law firm at a time in Los Angeles. This firm, it's one of the largest in the country, was representing several Black Panthers, 4 of them. And one of them, it turned out, because of the ACLU files, was working for the police department. He went to the lawyer and said, help me. The police are on my case. The law office helps them, and then they report back to the police department. There was a charge. O'Melveny and Meyer, one of the most prestigious law firms in Los Angeles, has accused the Los Angeles Police Department of misconduct after learning that one of their clients, purportedly a member of the Black Panther, was actually an undercover officer who used and monitored the firm's confidential discussion with the party. It's the second largest law office in the state. They agreed to represent some people, some Black Panthers, in 1977, and during the months, 4 members of those groups were represented by this law office, and one of them, David Bryant, was an informant for the police assigned by the Public Disorder Intelligence Division, and Bryant said that went all the way up to the top to Police Chief Daryl Gates. Bryant said he gave his intelligence to his superior reports on confidential talks between the Panther and the law office, and the law office was simply furious that they planted not a person who was in trouble with the law, but to spy on the law offices. So there's been some correspondence going down there. I mentioned because this is the law office that had a lot of protection, that thought they were representing clients, and they're actually representing informers from the police department. Now, Mr. Gates denies anything's wrong with this. He says that's all right. Gates issued a statement that he acted in good faith, and he knows of no breach of attorney-client relationship. Imagine you're sending a person to be represented at this law office who claims the police are after him. And he's actually sent there. The police aren't after him. He's paid by the police department to infiltrate the law office. Another whistleblower going on down L.A. right now, this Michael J. Rothmiller, was telling stories about Michael Zinzun, Z-I-N-Z-U-N. He was from the Black Guerrilla family, and the Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, that's the law office of William French Smith and also Ronald Reagan's firm. Reagan's not an attorney. He uses that law office. They're trying to discredit the case of Mr. Zinzun, that he was followed and the provocateurs of the police department infringe upon his rights. And he belongs to an organization CAPA, C-A-P-A, the Coalition Against Police Abuse. And I might have mentioned them before to you on the broadcast. Don Freed told me that when Zinzin testified for the pretrial deposition, that he mentioned Donald DeFreeze of the SLA, that the police department were in touch with him 1 hour before he died. Now that brings out the whole article, book-length article that I did on the SLA is the CIA, because the same Farwell, the police agent that worked with DeFreeze, worked with Louis Tackwood, making a whole cycle from the Watergate Squad 19 up to the SLA. And the purpose, again, for all this was to infiltrate groups in California such as the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, the Chino Defense Fund, the United Farm Workers, the Black Guerrilla Family, the Women's Movement, target them with the COINTEL program, which was set up by Tom Charles Houston of Young Americans for Freedom and the government intelligence agency. So out of those pretrial depositions or hearings, we may get into the SLA case, which is an interesting part of the whole era. And Ronald Reagan as governor, hoping when they got the free food, they would get what he said is botulism he thought they deserved. Another important story on the Los Angeles Police Department files is that in Washington, D.C., the federal government is now destroying these files. The archive is going back to the McCarthy era, the Korean War, Angela Davis, Paul Robeson, and the Rosenbergs. Now, why would they be destroying those files? I think that the whole chronology of the spies coming from the Pacific, the Young Americans for Freedom, being formed by Buckley on his home in Connecticut in 1960, was just an extension of Joe McCarthy era, with Robert Morris setting up and working for the internal subcommittee and then going down to Dallas and using hitmen or bringing them in from Germany when Kennedy was killed. I'll do more on that later, but the McCarthy era has a continuity of spies from the Defense Department and from Nazi Germany working with Franco in Spain, then in the Philippines with Japanese Nazis and the Reverend Moon, and then coming back into this country and forming front organizations. And now that we, the researchers, are getting the pattern or putting together what happened in the continuity of these various people, all of a sudden in Washington, D.C., the papers are being destroyed in the archives, and they've ordered them to stop destroying this information. But it's very valuable to put together the whole era. Now, after Henry Kissinger surfaced, and I'm going to do a lot on Henry Kissinger tonight, when he surfaced again on this great committee for the President of the United States, a man who worked with him closely, Peter Drucker, also was in the news the same week. There was sort of a chronology, if you remember. Alfred Bloomingdale died first, and Vicki Morgan was dead. Roy Cohn moved to Washington. Larry McDonald was dead. These people are all part of the Roy Cohn, Henry Kissinger, Fritz Kramer network. The 007 was shot down with Larry McDonald, whose Western Goals was linked to the police department that ties into Ronald Reagan's governorship, and William Casey got a quick award at the CIA. And while Henry Kissinger was having his mugshot in every newspaper on this new commission the president appointed, out of the woodwork came Mr. Drucker, Peter Drucker, D-R-U-C-K-E-R. He's not a household word for many of you. Maybe you don't know the name, but I've mentioned the history of Drucker. He came over from Frankfurt, Germany, was part of the milieu of Fritz Kramer, who runs Henry Kissinger, and he became the head of the multinational corporation, the idea that corporations are bigger than nations, and run the White House and give directions to the president and combine and swallow up little businesses. And just the week that Henry Kissinger was really swinging it, by September the 15th, Kissinger had his appointment. September the 25th, Drucker's in London, in the London Times and London Observer, with an article, The Guru of Management. And I'll give you a few sentences of it. It says, it's almost inconceivable to emerge from business school these days without knowing something, probably a great deal, about Peter Drucker. He so dominated management studies with his 20 books that when he flies into London this time, he has a novel with him, and this isn't about corporations. He uses the German-American accent, the trademark of instant authority in all matters from psychiatry to physics to Henry Kissinger, and if Henry Kissinger counts, diplomacy. Drucker is both charming and sharp. He's advised the mighty corporations from General Motors down, or you might say from General Motors up, and he's a professor of Oriental art and down in Claremont, California, where he lives, and he's a novelist. His daughter said when his new book came out, they were dismayed to find his father knew about sex. Well, if you know Henry Kissinger and Alfred Bloomingdale and Vicki Morgan, you know about sex. His daughters ought to catch on to that. Back in 1971, he was stomping the world, extolling the virtues of giant multinational corporations. Now his prime role is to tone down the big corporations, build your system of organized abandonment is important, he says. He's telling them organized abandonment. That's what Adolf Hitler used just when the war was kind of winding down in 1943 to reorganize in other places. He's giving opinions for corporations on jobs, but the important thing is that his picture really hasn't been in any newspapers that I've seen, or his name hasn't been thrown around. And then 10 days after Kissinger is back traveling in Central America, Drucker is in London, and Kissinger has a business in London. It's multinational, but Drucker was in the news, and I thought that was, maybe it was coincidental, I don't know. I do believe Drucker's responsible for bringing Fritz Kramer to this country and Fritz Kramer for bringing Henry Kissinger. And I do believe that the biggest single problem in the United States is Kissinger, Kramer, and Daniel Graham. Incidentally, the book Forces of Power that I've referred to many times by William Taub has a quotation about Henry Kissinger. I might have put on the air or not, by Le Doc Tho, T-H-O, out of North Vietnam. And in this book, he had explained to Mr. Taub that Henry Kissinger had arranged to destroy everything that had been done in North Vietnam, that they didn't want communism. They wanted a country that would get alone on its own resources. And he said Kissinger was referred to as a Nazi in his handling of world events. And that's the first time I've seen that in print, that he acts like a German. Now, Kissinger's face is everywhere lately. As I said before, they're trying to get a thing to run him for president. There's a news story out of New York, a social column. Forget Brooke Shields, Liz Taylor, and the dancing feet of 42nd Street. Henry Kissinger is riding the crest of a new I Love New York wave. They're having a popular advertising campaign, and East Siders can see Henry Kissinger's face that will be switched on with I Love New York. So he's on the billboards, that ugly face, who really should be exposed like Mussolini, but he is on the billboards. The Soviet Union had a story, a picture of Henry Kissinger there, reminding people, this came out of New Times just about 4 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. It says, who says the fame is not a saleable commodity when it costs too much and it doesn't keep? The example of some U.S. luminaries proves the contrary. Suffice it to say that Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, former President of National Security, and his aide, Brent Scowcroft, S-C-O-W, Scowcroft, and ex-CIA Director Richard Helms and William Colby, rather. All of them are consultants in the United States foreign firms, and the article says that they go on and they're reaping in the money. Kissinger and his consulting firm called Kissinger Associates Incorporated advises on anyone who wants to be relieved of money pouring in to various countries and wants to rely upon it. There's no shortage of clients. He services 12 transnational corporations, the former Secretary of State, and now he's on this new bipartisan committee, and they call it the Big Guns. Kissinger returns to the U.S. as the U.S. ships head for Nicaragua. And this article from New Times said that it might be good to look into what he did in Chile, the Middle East, Africa, Cambodia, and so forth. The Washington Times, D.C. Times, tells about a dinner party in Washington, D.C. that Henry Kissinger attended. Remember out in Northern California when they had the reunion of the greatest blackmailing, one article on the greatest blackmailing of all, the Bohemian Grove, and they played Hail to the Chief the year before last. Well, there was a party in Washington, D.C., and Henry Kissinger pointed the needling of Jesse Helms, and it tells how he almost stole the show, and he said, I never dreamed as a boy that there would be a time when I would address a dinner like this, not only because the President of the United States is here, because so many of his successors are here. I never heard it said before that I have the qualities to be President of the United States. I have said it myself. In fact, that's probably where I heard it. I may be the only person in this room who's barred by the Constitution by reason of birth from being President of the United States. It's not true, however, that this was the original Helms Amendment. They're trying to put in an amendment to make Henry Kissinger President of the United States. And another story, Henry Kissinger takes his mission to Latin America, and the diplomats said it's going to be another flying circus. And then a party in Denver, Colorado that his friend Davis gave. And the first thing in the social column, written in Los Angeles Herald, Denver, Henry Kissinger and Joan Collins are deep in a tete-a-tete. He's near on the dais is the 38th President of the United States, Gerald Ford, who was appointed by Crook Nixon. And Marvin Davis is having a party. The article is written by my cousin's daughter for the Los Angeles Herald Social Column. And the very first name there, the Davis's Big Bash, Henry Kissinger. He's making all the social columns, and he is on the billboards in New York. And they're trying to pass him off for all the world like the future president of the United States. And if we don't stop that, it just may happen. Look at all the other calamities that took place. We'll take a 1-minute break now and then get back to Henry Kissinger and what Henry Gonzalez said at Congress. It's really important to know that they are pushing this man, and when there's something against him, like before the Congress, when the president has appointed Kissinger to this staff, and a congressman gives a speech about him, a long speech, a half-hour speech, which I'll reduce to about 15 or 20 minutes, the essence of the speech. I didn't see it in any of the newspapers, and whoever sent it to me, I appreciate it. People that take world watches or listen, I appreciate your sending me these things, because they're things that I don't get. Don't assume that I have these items. Send me whatever you think I would use, and I'll let you know if I have it or not. I didn't have this, and I appreciate whoever sent it. This is side 2 of broadcast 621, and it's October the 31st, 1983. Now, this is the comment of Mr. Gonzalez. Henry Gonzalez has been in the Congress 30 years. He's not a newcomer. He knows what he's saying. This is September the 15th, 1983. Regarding Dr. Kissinger and his commission, Mr. Gonzalez was allowed 30 minutes. As I say, we'll reduce it to less than that, but it's important. Mr. Speaker, on July the 18th, President Ronald Reagan announced that he was appointing Dr. Henry Kissinger to head a commission on Central America, which he labeled as partisan. The idea, he said, was to come up with a long-term unified approach to policy in Central America. The idea of bipartisan commissions is not new, and it never answers questions to old problems. The whole foreign policy apparatus has been off in that area. He says for 5 years they're trying to solve something which has plagued successive administrations for 50 years. And if you want to know about the area, read the books on United Fruit with Alan Dulles and John J. McCloy and the who's who of who runs the country today. The idea of any commission of this sort is not to devise answers, but to make dissent from preconceived policy appear dishonorable. If you didn't like this, and these people say we need it, you are dishonorable, perhaps even unpatriotic. Commissions are a way to take issues out of the realm of debate and discussion. Whenever there's something controversial in Congress, now you appoint a commission like the MX, they get their heads together and tell you what you need, and there's no discussion on the Congress, and this is what he's saying. The Greenspan Commission, for instance, did not devise any magic plan to save Social Security. Its purpose was to take it off the table to enable previously disagreeing parties to represent action that they had already devised and to make it palatable. This is the task of the Kissinger Commission, to throw a blanket over any dissent from present actions in Central America, while at the same time issuing long-range recommendations that change absolutely nothing, while ringing with high-sounding but essentially meaningless affirmations and declarations and obfuscations. Kissinger himself is frank about this. In August, he said, "I believe in the overwhelming national interest not to have Central America turn into a major political cause. Any president would be grateful to have a commission on whose report he will rely so that he will not start a huge controversy. Don't let everyone in Congress fight it out. Have a commission." He says, in case that is not clear enough, he also said, Henry Kissinger, it seems to be desirable to take Central America out of politics. Translated, that means hand it to the Defense Department. I'll intersperse some comments, but most of it will be Representative Gonzalez. Clearly, Henry Kissinger understands that his job is not to suggest any change at all in the Ronald Reagan policy, that the commission will stay out of operational issues. In other words, they won't examine or say anything about what is happening. They won't talk about whether it's desirable to have clandestine operations against Nicaragua regime, or long-range maneuvers or wide-scale training operations or activities in Honduras, and whether they make sense. They will not talk about the question of curbing death squads in El Salvador or how to give popular opinion any real voice there. In short, the Commission has nothing to do and nothing to say about the actions that have given rise to the controversy in the first place. Meanwhile, the existing policies, the source of all the controversy, will never be tampered with. The whole idea is to avoid dissent and debate, because in the Henry Kissinger view, we really cannot afford another searing debate like we had 10 years ago. In his view, it would have been unfortunate to have a debate about the wisdom of bombing Cambodia. You know what he did there, or the invasion there. Therefore, the secret war, which was a vast controversy in his view, should not have happened. In fact, the only thing to do in Vietnam, according to him, was to liquidate the whole commitment and reduce the controversy, but to do so slowly at home and work out a deal. He reduced the controversy and spent tens of thousands of lives, and in the end failed to save Vietnam and sent Cambodia down the road to one of the bloodiest slaughters in all human history. The only thing Kissinger achieved was his domestic political goal to allow Richard Nixon to proclaim an honorable peace, and certainly this was as elusive a statement as ever devised since Chamberlain pronounced that he had struck a bargain with Adolf Hitler. Henry Kissinger knows well what his role is to do. It is to rationalize existing policy in Central America, to smother defense by making it appear partisan, and therefore suspect or even dishonorable if you don't like it. That was his goal in Vietnam, and it worked. He cloaked his unmitigated disaster in terms that tried to hide what could not be hidden, in mirror tricks that he started to distract us from a weary and worried population. After that performance in Vietnam, his present job was throwing a blanket over like Central America ought to be quite a pushover for Henry Kissinger. It cannot last very long. One cannot forever pretend that Pinochet in Chile is angelic, nor the right-wing killer squads of El Salvador are expressing any popular will, nor that the people of Nicaragua are demanding the ouster of the Sandinista, when none of this is true. This is Henry Gonzalez before Congress, September the 15th, 1983, about Henry Kissinger. He says, any more than a case could be made for Rios Montt, the paragon of good government in Guatemala. Eventually, questions have to be asked, but Henry Kissinger does his job as he hopes that it will not be for a good while, and in the meantime, he will build up his own personal empire. By the time you ask those questions, he will have built up his empire. He said, nobody is better suited to the task of smoothing over the troubled waters of an unwise policy than Henry Kissinger. Nobody is better suited than him to defend and rationalize the indefensible. This is the arrogance of Henry Kissinger, of course. He has not only done it before, he made a whole career out of it, and in the process of building a considerable fortune as a result of it. I might intersperse that that's why I think that Fritz Kramer, his mentor, and with the monocle from Frankfurt and Hamburg and from Italy and so forth, with his nefarious career at the Bulge, we have to find out who that man is, because Kissinger has carte blanche and runs over the entire country. He said, I brought out my views in a news conference in my district in Texas. Back home, I said that Mr. Kissinger formed a private consulting association known as Henry Kissinger and Associates. His principal associate is Lord Carrington, the former foreign minister of England, plus an array of former officials of past and present and semi-officials ranging from Mr. Scowcroft, that same gentleman who gave the same performance with respect to the Scowcroft Commission that was bipartisan in order to try and make the MX missile program palatable, like they're doing in Central America, to Congress, and above all, William Rogers. Now, Rogers, he says, is not the same one who was former Assistant Secretary of State. This Rogers that he's talking about is not the one that former Secretary of State. There's two William Rogers. One William Rogers is on the board of 20th Century Fox with Henry Kissinger under Marvin Davis. He was the one in charge of the Shah of Iran's shenanigans. The oil price is going up, the importation of Nazi, the the one from Resorts International. That's the Nixon Henry Rogers. There's a different Henry Rogers, this one, who was the former secretary. He's not the one under Nixon. He is the former Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, who last year accumulated $300,000 as an agent, sending the Sandinista government to buy arms. Now, one reason they would pour money, I would think, into the Sandinistas is just so they have an excuse to counter and come back at them and take the whole country. The man working with Henry Kissinger now supplied $300,000 last year to the Sandinistas. That's like arming the Black Panthers in Los Angeles and giving them weapons and guns so the police department can come in and take the Black Panthers. Back to the Congressional Record. Mr. Kissinger has made his financial profit from that kind of consultantship, that kind of deal and association, and he continues to do so even as I'm speaking here today, so that the boys that are in Honduras dying, before we say it is training, actually that we've taken over Honduras, they're occupying Honduras, will be up against the shooting of weapons that his friend William Rogers and from the State Department have supplied in the past year. Our boys will be fired upon with the guns procured by Mr. Henry Kissinger and Associates. Does that sound like Lebanon, where all those weapons there that killed several hundred of Americans were sent by Kissinger and Associates over in Lebanon earlier? As a matter of fact, I charge that Mr. Kissinger, this is Henry Gonzalez, has his own private State Department. And this is pretty heavy on the floor of Congress. His own private State Department. This is what I've alleged for a long time. And today I'm introducing a resolution in the Congress of inquiry in order to find out exactly what the connections are with this administration, particularly the Secretary of State and Mr. Kissinger. They're very much present together, and almost as if a hired consultant by Mr. Schultz, Henry Kissinger, our Secretary of State. He even has his own parking space at the State Department next to Mr. Schultz. I figured that maybe this administration is contracting out our State Department diplomatic activities to Henry Kissinger. This administration is contracting out the State Department to Henry Kissinger. This is exactly what I've said after the war was over in Nazi Germany. Our State Department contracted to Reinhard Gehlen and the top Nazis and threw this country down the drain. This is the closest I've seen where Gonzalez is saying that the administration contracts Mr. Schultz to Mr. Kissinger. I would like to know exactly on what basis, if any, the State Department has thus far contracted with Henry Kissinger and Associates, and if so, how much they've dished out and under what conditions and what purposes. And more is happening here in our United States. He said, the truth is that there are more of our foreign envoys in the United States beating a path all the way from the French ambassador and other ministers from France to Nigeria and some from South American countries by way of Mr. Rogers, who is the lawyer or the agent for the activity, and up until at least this year, what is the reportable amount and how can we get the information? As Mr. Rogers said, he was paid $300,000 by the Sandinistas. For what? For arms procurement? For what is the president telling us about the Sandinistas, and what is that Mr. Rogers doing with Henry Kissinger? He says this is another case of contradiction, and it is abhorrent to me that they're arming one side and the other, and that Mr. Rogers is working with Henry Kissinger. He says, I did not speak until August the 27th at home until I had the Congressional Research Service supply the answer to the question I directed to confirm the existence of Henry Kissinger and Associates. Now, maybe we can get the same Congressional Research Service to find out if Fritz Kramer of Henry Kissinger's mentor is that Nazi criminal with number 33. Maybe that's who we write to, the Congressional Research Service. And some of you might, pardon me, you want to wait? Wait a minute, would you want to get out of here a minute? There's somebody, we're taping this. There's somebody that just came in the room, and it bothers me. And this goes on other stations, and we don't do that. Thank you. Pardon me, I'm sorry. He says, according to okay, we'll get back to this testimony. I did not speak until August 27th back home, where the Congressional Research Service supplied me with answers to these questions, and I asked them to ask about Henry Kissinger and associate activities. Henry Kissinger is not only an advisor, he is a hired gun set up as Kissinger Associates, ready to advise anybody on any foreign policy, problems in the United States if the price is right. He is calling him a hired gun. According to Mr. Scowcroft, it takes about $250,000 to see Henry Kissinger to get the entrance door for the consultation. Lord Carrington, that's a strange one, former foreign minister of Great Britain, is his associate. And among his associates, as I said, and he repeats, is Brent Scowcroft, who lately sold us the MX program by producing a contradiction in terms, a program calling for deployment that is totally vulnerable in the name of making the United States vulnerable, the MX program. And remember, the MX program, the Scowcroft recommendation, went through because the Larry McDonald plane went down over Korea. They got rid of a man who has information on Western goals, on Mr. Ducote, Jerry Ducote, on the Los Angeles Police Department, Reagan's administration, on Roy Cohn and the whole network of people that blackmailed the president and worked with the police departments. When that plane went down, the MX went through. He says Kissinger's clients know that he has access to everybody that counts, or at least that's what he has impressed them with in this country. He makes certain that everyone knows that he is the most intimate terms with George Shultz. And if we believe Mr. Kissinger, not only a regular lunch companion, but who can be called and advised on how to handle the Russians and what to do in the Middle East. You've seen the Middle East policy. You've seen riots of Pinochet or what goes on in the Philippines or Southeast Asia. This is Henry Kissinger ever since he's been in this country where Mossadegh, the first democracy, was overthrown in Iran and the oil gush for the Chase Manhattan, and the State Department got the profits of the banking of the oil in the Shah of Iran in that strategic area. But he's talking about Henry Kissinger and how Henry Kissinger is bragging about his position with these particular people. He says most likely they will proclaim that nobody but Henry Kissinger can solve that riddle of Central America after the Middle East. And if some client suspects that Shultz is not presently the man who is heard by the president's good ear, Kissinger let it be known that it was Mr. Judge Clark. And remember, Judge Clark was in military counterintelligence when he brought Helene von Dahm to this country to Ronald Reagan and von Bolschwing. He's saying the president's good ear is received by Judge Clark, the security advisor who is now in charge of the Interior, who thought of the commission in the first place and begged him to serve on it. But the great man, according to Henry Gonzalez, the great man, Kissinger, said, at first he was reluctant. He would hate to turn the president down, though, meaning, in quotes, I want my clients to know that Ronald Reagan himself had no other candidate for me but this great and this historic task. After Vicki Morgan's head was cracked open, they didn't have any other clients, and I challenged them to explain what that means, that there's nobody that can handle Central America after the way that Chase Manhattan and the Rockefellers handled South America with their literal slave labor and their dictatorships, the arrogance of this man. And again, this is the person who was put in there by the faceless Fritz Kramer. We only have one picture of him in 1970 that was received by Congressman Panetta. He got it for me. He said, this is the line that Kissinger's clients hear, that the president didn't have anybody but him. He's telling his clients at the business on how to handle that problem for the United States. Of course, we're talking about the same thing on the level that we were talking before. And now he gets into the formation of these gigantic political action committees. The political action they want preferential treatment and access to the sources of power. In our case, those PAC boys do not give $10,000 to a congressman because they like the color of his eyes, but because when any pending legislation comes up, they want to know if they have preferential access. Now, to interject Henry Gonzalez's speech before Congress, remember how outraged I was, I think it was broadcast number 617, that Mr. Daniel Graham, the partner with Fritz Kramer, is starting political action committees for his space station. Those genocidal policies that were written up in Alternative 3 with Robert Morris up and Gerard O'Neill up at Princeton, the whole military counterintelligence group. That's what those political actions are, and Gonzalez would be wanting a piece of it if they were honorable. And it's interesting that he brings up the PAC, and I'll send him a transcription of tonight's broadcast because the crux of the problem is Kissinger, Kramer, and Graham with Robert Morris. And if I have to say it every week and draw it out for you, I will. And he's asking, what about this? Then he goes on, Scowcroft, who is Kissinger's associate in his company and should know what's going on. He should know, says that the price of going to see Henry Kissinger, and he repeats it, is $250,000 a throw. Now, this is a business that Kissinger maintains at the same time that he's heading this commission. He uses the commission to boost his visibility and build his credibility and to make it clear that he is, in effect, a State Department of his own. By golly, this is the free enterprise system at its best, without official portfolio, ready for sale or rent to those who have the money to pay. He's called him a hired gun. He's talked about the Political Action Committee. Now he's talking about his visibility. Remember, those of you that listen to World Watcher, that when he was on the point of this commission, I started saving pictures of him. There was Kissinger with Gerald Ford. There was Kissinger with his arms about the president. There was Haig with Kissinger. Richard Helms came out of the woodwork. Mr. Rogers with Henry Kissinger. I never saw a face in any news story so many times in the first 2 or 3 weeks as Henry Kissinger. And as I mentioned before, the newspaper referred to his trip in South America as a flying circus. It wasn't a circus. It was visibility to show the clients who spent $250,000 for him to recommend to them what's going on. That was to get him in the news. There's no other way. That face was plastered all over. And now they have him plastered in the billboards in New York. I love New York, love Henry Kissinger. Send him back to Germany. Send him to the Soviet Union, be tried as a war criminal for what happened at the Battle of the Bulge, or working with Klaus Barbie at the intelligence operation along with the top Nazis before John McCloy put him at Harvard. This man is a disease in this country, is sick. And until we get to the root of those people like Kramer and Kissinger, you will pay your dues. You're paying, what is it, $1 million a minute? That was the budget I had last week, the report on weapons. So if I'm on 1 hour, you've spent $60 million or a debt for your children and your children's children. The World Bank can't hold it. And this is a statement from Congressional Record, September 15th, 1983. If you want to look it up or copy it in your library, it's Mr. Gonzalez. The section here is 1640. The page of it is on page H6999, 6,999. If you want to look up the reference of that particular day and copy it. He says that he makes himself visible, which is exactly what I was saying, at $250,000 a throw. He said, compare that to Clark Clifford, who was hired to evaluate Vietnam as Secretary of Defense, and he tells how he at least put his business aside and didn't run them at the same time. And he goes into the tragedy of Southeast Asia and the people that fought and were bombed in Thailand and Cambodia and North Vietnam, and how he destroyed the city down there and just left blood and death wherever it happened to fall at Kissinger's discretion. Now, one member of the Congress interjected here. He interrupted Mr. Gonzalez, Mr. McEwen, M.C., small c, W-E-W-E-N. And he said, can I speak for a few minutes? And he interjected here that one person who isn't there to defend the invasion of Nicaragua and so forth is the empty seat today of our colleague, that's Representative Larry McDonald, who was murdered in cold blood by the Soviet Union, and Nicaragua chose the National Security Council not to condemn the activity. So this Congressman McEwen takes over the floor to say, look, Nicaragua isn't so great. We should really be there because those people don't even attack the Soviet Union. And if you've been reading the stories lately, the whole Soviet propaganda thing was a total lie. They knew the plane where it was going. They knew what was going to happen. They knew it could be blown down. And they martyred this man. And every once in a while, these people get up and say, well, remember that plane in Nicaragua didn't condemn the Soviets. Nicaragua was waiting to see what was going on. And rightly so, and they didn't make a fool of themselves like the Soviet Union. And Mr. Gonzalez took back the floor and he said, I don't want to get sidetracked into the diversionary area of whether or not Nicaragua said anything to condemn the Soviet Union, because I'm talking about Henry Kissinger and his business. He says what we're talking about, we're not talking about the same thing. He says what I'm talking about, and I repeat this business, of Mr. Kissinger maintaining his own private business and profiting on the sides personally. It's one of the biggest sources of his present income. And on top of that, it also pointed out in a press conference, Mr. Kissinger is also at the same time a paid consultant of Chase Manhattan Bank, which has a heavy stake into large segments of Latin American press. Well, they own practically all the control of the governments in Latin America and put in the dictatorships. And he says, I'm talking about large segments and the overwhelming majority of those countries in South America, Central America, and Mexico that are involved with these huge, compelling payment of debts, and the U.S. banks has to do with the Rockefellers and Chase Manhattan, Henry Kissinger's full-time paid on them. He said, we in the United States, in our self-image, must wait and find out that outside of our shores, our self-image is not necessarily the image held of us, and that it is important we don't deceive ourselves on this point. Henry Gonzalez says, don't fool yourself that people think of us in these terms. It's indefensible. And when you find out these obvious conflicts of interest, he says they have everything to do with the destiny of our country and its future relations, not faraway nations, but with our next door. Mr. Kissinger was selected to defend. He wasn't appointed by the president to condemn any of the actions down there, the massive intervention, the most massive in the history of that area of the world, sending in the Marines and so forth. And he said, how many of you know the terms of the secret arrangements that Mr. Kissinger made any more than Americans know? He said, Mr. Kissinger, in my presence, lied to me in 1973 at the Paris Peace Conference about an accommodation that made with the Vietnamese of reparations, and we had promised them $3 billion in reconstruction. Henry Kissinger made the deal and reneged on it and didn't give him a cent. And Gonzalez said, I got back in touch with Nixon, and they admitted, yes, that this did come up at the Paris Peace Conference, but never went around and never came about. He said he's put in a position now of high visibility. This is the character and the pattern of the behavior of Mr. Kissinger to break back his promises or agreement. He's highly visible. He is now on the bipartisan commission, has Mr. Harry Slatterman, Slatterman, who was the ambassador to Argentina, but was the CIA's station chief in Chile when we were intervening to destroy Allende's regime. Kissinger is not only an advisor, he repeats he's a hired gun set up by Kissinger associates. You know, I wonder why the Congress is so quiet about things, why they never say anything, that they sit back and take all this. The answer is that there are people saying it, but the American news media and the Associated Press, United Press, Tom Brokaw, or Dan Rather, you don't hear them repeating what this man is saying about the reputation of the United States, about a sleazy guy like Kissinger crawling around on his belly, taking money from these people, high visibility, selling out this country. And he refers to him again as a hire gun, and he says the price is right. If anyone has it, they'll go to him. Kissinger's clients know that he has access to everybody who counts in the United States on the most intimate terms, and that his commission boasts its visibility and credibility because that gives him an official portfolio ready for sale or rent to anyone who has the money to pay. I can't imagine any greater conflict or interest than this man who uses this appointment to build his private business of influencing peddling. And that's what I said about that visibility of Henry Kissinger and what he's doing to push his face into the news and sell his business. He says he doesn't want to change the present policy. He knows that his job is to try and provide respectability and cover for keeping the status quo in Central America. People who hire Kissinger are those who have great stakes tied up in the way things are now, whose future fortune depends on it, on keeping the president order alive and not making any changes. They don't care about hunger. They don't care about poverty among the people down there. They don't care how much we're frustrating democratic processes, how much he kills reform or sanctioning policies that make it absolutely anathema to people at home, that people in the United States have no idea what he's pushing down there. The people who have found Kissinger useful over the years have investments to protect, interests to protect, fortunes to preserve. There are those folks who pay so handsomely for the advice of this former Secretary of State, the former security advisor, that he's not going to espouse any single policy that interrupts their profits. He'll use every tactic to keep that money going, that profit, as against the wishes of those people. And it says he's doing a disservice by postponing the day, of reckoning, of raising the cost of the failure. We failed in every country where he is, and he postpones the day of reckoning because we have to pay for it later, and he will not rock any boats, of course, and these excesses and the extravagances that he depends upon, his lifestyle and so forth, will continue. He says he is driven by powerful forces, and Kissinger is doing what he knows best. He knows what he's doing. He's recommending the interests and the profits of a few. The administration knows there's no danger that his commission will go astray from their central issue in Central America of debate. He's for clandestine operations. He dazzles out to hide the important questions. He hides secret wars. He smothers debate. That's his second nature. Why should Congress be deaf and dumb to Henry Kissinger? And Gonzalez passed a resolution in Congress, a resolution to request that the president provide certain information as to the Henry Kissinger and Associates and the business activity of Henry Kissinger, and that we know who puts money into the till, who his clients are, what services he provides, how he mingles business with foreign policy. Well, that is the Congressional Record, Henry Gonzalez, September 15th, and I will write to the committee in Washington that he has to investigate Kissinger Associates, and maybe we can find about his mentor, the great Fritz Kramer. In the meantime, our hour is up. I'll be back with you next week on the news, and we'll update some of these sleazy characters. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California.